Sir, I need you to step out of that seat immediately or we're calling security. The words hit 17-year-old Damon Rivers like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting them from the moment he'd walked onto Flight 847. He'd known this was coming, had felt it building in the air around him like the pressure before a thunderstorm, but hearing it spoken aloud still made his stomach drop to somewhere around his worn-out sneakers. 3 hours earlier, Damon had been standing at the check-in kiosk at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, fumbling with his phone to pull up the confirmation email for his economy seat, when the machine had started blinking red and making that urgent beeping sound that meant something was wrong. He'd looked around nervously, wondering if he'd somehow messed up his booking, when a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Sarah had appeared at his elbow. "Don't worry, honey," Sarah had said, her fingers flying over her computer terminal with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for 20 years. "Looks like we've got an overbooking situation in economy, and since you're traveling on one of those aerospace youth scholarship programs, the computer system just bumped you all the way up to first class." She'd smiled at his shocked expression, the printer whirring to life behind her. Sometimes the universe just decides to be nice to the good kids. Damon had stared at the boarding pass she'd handed him, reading the words Seat 1A over and over again, like they might disappear if he blinked too hard. First class wasn't a place where kids like him belonged. Kids who shopped at thrift stores and had patches sewn onto their backpacks by grandmothers who believed that if you took care of your things, they'd take care of you. His backpack was a perfect example of that philosophy, a faded blue JanSport that had seen him through 4 years of high school, decorated with patches from NASA, SpaceX, and the Aerospace Institute, where he'd just finished the most incredible 3 months of his life. The internship in Phoenix had been everything he'd dreamed about, and more, working alongside actual rocket scientists and engineers who treated his questions with respect instead of condescension, who saw his potential instead of his zip code. For 12 weeks, he'd been surrounded by people who understood why he stayed up until 2 in the morning reading about propulsion systems, who didn't think it was weird that he could calculate orbital mechanics in his head but still got nervous ordering food at restaurants he couldn't afford. Now he was flying home to Detroit, back to the apartment he shared with his mother Angela, in a building where the elevator worked maybe half the time, and the walls were thin enough that you could hear your neighbors' conversations whether you wanted to or not. His mother worked double shifts at Detroit Medical Center, pulling back-to-back 12-hour days in the intensive care unit, because nursing was one of those jobs that demanded everything you had, and then asked for more, and she'd been doing it for 15 years, so that Damon could have opportunities she'd never had. Walking through the jet bridge toward Flight 847, Damon had felt that familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest, the one that always showed up when he found himself in spaces where people like him were expected to be invisible, grateful, and above all, quiet. He'd pulled his hoodie down and straightened his shoulders, trying to look like someone who belonged in Seat 1A, even though every instinct he'd developed over 17 years of living while black in America was telling him that someone was going to ask questions. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was like stepping into a different world, one where the seats looked more like individual offices than anything you'd find on a bus, where the lighting was soft and warm instead of the harsh fluorescence of economy, and where everything smelled like leather and some kind of expensive cologne instead of recycling air and industrial disinfectant. Damon had moved carefully through the space, terrified that he might accidentally bump into something that cost more than his mother made in a month, until he found his seat and sank into leather that was softer than his bed at home. He'd been pulling out his calculus textbook, thinking he could get some studying done during the flight, when the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted like the barometric pressure before a tornado. The sound of expensive high heels clicking against the floor had echoed through the space with the rhythm of an approaching army, accompanied by a voice that could have cut glass. "I don't care what your computer says, Patricia. I have been flying this route twice a month for 8 years, and I always sit in 1A because of my circulation issues. And if you think I'm going to accept some ridiculous downgrade because your booking system can't keep track of Platinum Medallion members, then you clearly don't understand who you're dealing with." The voice belonged to a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine about yacht ownership and charity galas, all sharp angles and expensive highlights that probably cost more than Damon's family spent on groceries in 3 months. She was wearing a cream-colored suit that fit her like it had been custom-made, which it probably had, and oversized sunglasses that she refused to remove despite being indoors, as if the mere sight of commercial aviation was too vulgar for her delicate sensibilities. Behind her trailed a man who was obviously her husband, carrying what appeared to be half a luggage store while looking like he wanted to disappear into the airplane's carpeting. He was muttering something about just taking whatever seats were available, that they had a meeting in Boston and couldn't afford delays, but his wife was having none of it. "Bradley, stop being so weak," the woman had snapped, not bothering to lower her voice, even though other passengers were starting to stare. "This is about principle. I pay more for airline tickets than most people make in a year, and I expect the service I've paid for." Patricia, the flight attendant, was doing her best to maintain her professional composure, but Damon could see the stress lines forming around her eyes as she checked and rechecked her tablet, looking for some solution that would make this nightmare passenger go away. "Mrs. Ashworth, I completely understand your frustration, and I want to resolve this as quickly as possible. Let me check with our gate agent to see if there's been any kind of system error." But Victoria Ashworth wasn't interested in reasonable solutions or gate agents. She was interested in what she'd always been interested in: getting exactly what she wanted when she wanted it, regardless of who got hurt in the process. And right now, what she wanted was Seat 1A, which meant that Damon Rivers was about to become collateral damage in a battle he'd never asked to fight. Victoria had stopped directly in front of his seat, her ice-blue eyes scanning him from head to toe, like a security guard examining a suspicious package. She'd taken in his hoodie, his worn sneakers, his textbook, and most importantly, his age and the color of his skin. And Damon had watched her face change, as all those details combined into a conclusion that made perfect sense to her worldview. Patricia Victoria had set her voice, dropping to what she probably thought was a discreet whisper, but was actually loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I need you to explain to me why there is a teenager in my seat." Victoria Ashworth had spent 43 years of her life perfecting the art of getting what she wanted through a carefully calibrated combination of money status and the kind of barely contained rage that made service industry workers break into cold sweats. She'd been born into old Detroit money, the kind that came from automotive fortunes built in the 1940s and carefully maintained through strategic marriages, political connections, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge that the world had changed since her grandfather's time. Her father had taught her that there were 2 kinds of people in the world: those who mattered and those who served those who mattered, and that the secret to a successful life was never ever getting confused about which category you belonged to. She'd married Bradley Ashworth not out of love, but because he was a useful idiot with defense contractor connections who could provide her with the lifestyle she'd been raised to expect, and because he was just weak enough that she could control him completely. For 2 decades, Victoria had used her husband's business as a front for activities that would have made her country club friends clutch their pearls if they'd had any idea what was really happening behind the facade of charity galas and political fundraisers. Bradley's company, Ashworth Defense Solutions, held contracts for some of the most sensitive military technology in the American arsenal, and Victoria had discovered that there were certain foreign governments willing to pay extraordinary sums for information that was supposed to be classified. The money laundering operation she'd designed was elegant in its simplicity. Fake charity organizations that hosted real events, attended by real people who had no idea they were providing cover for international arms dealing. The donations that poured into these organizations were actually payments from buyers around the world, and the administrative costs that got transferred to offshore accounts were actually Victoria's cut of the profits. It was a perfect system that had made her incredibly wealthy and completely untouchable, or at least that's what she'd believed until this exact moment when a 17-year-old black kid in a hoodie was sitting in her seat and threatening to disrupt the carefully controlled environment that allowed her to conduct her business. Bradley was shifting nervously behind her, checking his phone every 30 seconds and sweating through his expensive shirt despite the airplane's air conditioning. "Victoria, please let's just sit somewhere else. Sit. We have the meeting with the Singapore clients tomorrow, and if we miss this flight, it's because this airline can't properly manage their seating assignments." Victoria had interrupted, her voice rising to a level that made conversations throughout the first-class cabin come to an abrupt halt. "I specifically requested the bulkhead seat because of my circulation issues, and now I'm supposed to accept some downgrade because they've given my seat to a child who obviously doesn't belong here." She'd turned back to Patricia, her patience officially exhausted. "I want to see your manifest. I want to see the exact booking records that show how this mistake happened, because I can guarantee you that this boy did not pay for a first-class seat, which means either your computer system has suffered a catastrophic failure or someone has made a decision that is going to cost this airline a very expensive lesson in customer service." Damon had been watching this entire exchange with the detached fascination of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion. He'd known from the moment Victoria Ashworth had laid eyes on him exactly how this was going to end. It didn't matter that he had a valid boarding pass, didn't matter that the airline's computer had legitimately upgraded him, didn't matter that he'd done absolutely nothing wrong. What mattered was that Victoria Ashworth was a middle-aged white woman with money and status, and the absolute conviction that the world owed her exactly what she demanded, and he was a black teenager whose presence in first class represented a fundamental challenge to the natural order she'd been raised to defend. Patricia was looking back and forth between Victoria and Damon like a referee in a boxing match who was rapidly losing control of the situation. She'd been working for the airline for 12 years, and she'd dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about Victoria Ashworth's barely contained fury was setting off alarm bells in her head. This wasn't just ordinary entitlement. This was something deeper and more dangerous. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm going to call our lead flight attendant to help resolve this situation," Patricia had said, reaching for the intercom button. "I'm sure we can find a solution that works for everyone." "The solution is very simple," Victoria had replied, taking a step closer to Damon's seat. "This child moves to whatever seat he actually paid for, and I take my rightful place in 1A. I don't understand why this is complicated." For the first time since the confrontation had begun, Victoria had addressed Damon directly, leaning down so that her face was only inches from his. "Young man, I'm sure you're very excited about sitting in first class, but this seat belongs to someone who actually paid for it. Now, I don't want to cause a scene, but if you don't move voluntarily, I'm going to have to ask the flight crew to remove you." Damon had looked up at her, taking in her perfectly applied makeup and her diamond tennis bracelet, and her expression of absolute certainty that she was in the right, and he'd felt something inside his chest crystallize into a hard, cold point of determination. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice quiet but steady, "I have a boarding pass for this seat. If there's been some kind of mistake, I'm sure the airline will figure it out, but I'm not moving until someone official tells me I have to." The silence that had followed his words had been deafening, like the moment of perfect stillness before a bomb goes off. Roger Martinez had been working as a lead flight attendant for Continental Airways for nearly 2 decades, and in that time he'd developed what he thought was an unshakable professional calm that could handle everything from medical emergencies to unruly passengers to mechanical failures that required emergency landings. He'd talked suicidal passengers out of opening emergency exits at 30,000 feet. He'd delivered babies in airplane bathrooms, and he'd once spent 6 hours keeping a plane load of passengers calm during a hijacking attempt that had ended with federal marshals storming the aircraft. But as he walked toward the brewing confrontation in first class, summoned by Patricia's increasingly desperate intercom calls, Roger felt his professional confidence wavering in a way that made his hands shake slightly as he adjusted his tie. There was something about the energy radiating from seat 1A that set every one of his survival instincts on high alert. Something that told him this wasn't just another difficult passenger situation, but rather the kind of powder keg that could destroy careers and end up on the evening news. Victoria Ashworth was standing in the aisle with her arms crossed and her foot tapping against the carpeted floor with the rhythmic precision of a metronome counting down to disaster, while her husband Bradley lurked behind her, looking like he wanted to crawl into the overhead compartment and disappear. The other first-class passengers had given up any pretense of minding their own business and were watching the drama unfold with the fascination of people who knew they were witnessing something that would make an excellent dinner party story for months to come. "Mr. Martinez," Patricia had said when Roger appeared, her voice carrying the kind of forced cheerfulness that airline employees used when they were about 30 seconds away from a complete nervous breakdown. "Mrs. Ashworth has some concerns about the seating arrangements that I thought you might be able to help address." Roger had taken one look at Victoria's face and immediately understood that this was not a woman who was interested in reasonable solutions or diplomatic compromises. This was a woman who had decided that she was going to win this confrontation through sheer force of will, and God help anyone who got in her way. Mrs. Ashworth Roger had said, his voice dropping into the soothing tones he'd perfected over years of dealing with people who believed that their platinum status gave them the right to treat airline employees like personal servants. "I apologize for any confusion about the seating. Let me take a look at our manifest and see what might have happened." But even as he'd pulled out his tablet and started scrolling through the passenger list, Roger had known exactly what he was going to find. Damon Rivers had been legitimately upgraded due to an economy overbooking situation, which meant that technically, legally, and morally, the boy had every right to be sitting in seat 1A. The problem was that Victoria Ashworth was a Platinum Medallion member who flew Continental Airways twice a month and had personally gotten 3 flight attendants fired over the past 5 years for what she'd termed unacceptable service failures. Roger had a mortgage on a house in a Detroit suburb that was still underwater from the 2008 financial crisis, 2 kids in college whose tuition payments were bleeding him dry, and a wife who'd been laid off from her teaching job 6 months ago and was still looking for work. He couldn't afford to lose this job. Couldn't afford to have Victoria Ashworth file a complaint that would end up in his permanent employment record. Couldn't afford to be the latest casualty in her war against anyone who dared to tell her no. Mrs. Ashworth Roger had said, closing his tablet and looking directly at Damon for the first time. "I can see there's been some confusion with our booking system. While this passenger does have a valid boarding pass for seat 1A, it appears that our computer failed to account for your platinum status priority override." The lie had tasted like ashes in his mouth, but Roger had told himself that it was a small lie, a harmless lie, the kind of white lie that airline employees told dozens of times every day to keep flights running on schedule and customers happy. He'd told himself that it wasn't really about race, that any passenger would be asked to move under similar circumstances, that he was just following company policy about accommodating high-value frequent flyers. Damon had looked up at Roger with an expression that had cut straight through all of his rationalizations and justifications, an expression that said very clearly that they both knew exactly what was happening, and exactly why it was happening, and that all the corporate doublespeak in the world couldn't disguise the fundamental injustice of the moment. Sir Damon had set his voice, careful and controlled in the way that black teenagers learned early if they wanted to survive encounters with authority figures who already saw them as threats. "I was told at check-in that this upgrade was legitimate. Do you have some documentation showing that there was an error?" Roger had felt something twist in his stomach at the quiet dignity in the boy's voice, at the way Damon was trying so hard to follow the rules and be reasonable, even as the adults around him conspired to humiliate him. But Victoria Ashworth was standing there with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and Roger's mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks, and sometimes good people had to make terrible choices because the world didn't offer them any alternatives. Son Roger had said the word feeling foreign and condescending in his mouth. I understand your confusion, but Mrs. Ashworth's reservation has priority in our system. We've found you another seat in the main cabin, and we'd like to offer you a $50 voucher for the inconvenience. Row 31. Patricia had added helpfully, reading from her tablet. It's an aisle seat. Row 31 is by the bathrooms, Damon had pointed out. His voice still steady, but with an edge of something that might have been anger or might have been heartbreak. And it's a middle seat, not an aisle. It's a seat on the airplane Victoria had interjected her patients finally completely exhausted, which is more than you paid for in the first place. Now please collect your belongings so we can finish boarding this flight. Damon had sat there for a long moment, his hands resting on his calculus textbook, his NASA patches catching the overhead lighting. Roger could see him thinking, could see him weighing his options and calculating the consequences of different choices. The boy could have made a scene, could have raised his voice and demanded to speak to supervisors and threatened lawsuits, and he probably would have been within his rights to do all of those things. Instead, Damon had closed his textbook and carefully placed it in his backpack, his movements deliberate and controlled. He'd unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, and for a moment he'd towered over Victoria Ashworth, all 6 feet, and 2 inches of him looking down at her perfectly styled hair. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice quiet enough that only the people in the immediate vicinity could hear him. "I hope you enjoy the seat. I hope it's everything you thought it would be." Then he'd shouldered his backpack and walked toward the back of the plane, his head held high and his shoulders straight, while Victoria had immediately claimed seat 1A like a conquering army planting a flag on occupied territory. She'd settled into the leather with a satisfied sigh, accepting the champagne that Patricia had immediately offered while Roger had supervised Damon's relocation to row 31, where he'd found himself squeezed between a businessman eating a tuna fish sandwich and a young mother whose baby had been crying since takeoff. But what neither Victoria Ashworth nor Roger Martinez had known was that Judge Helen Washington, retired from the federal court for the Eastern District of Michigan, had been sitting in seat 1B the entire time, taking detailed notes on everything she'd witnessed. And what none of them had known was that the airline's computer system had automatically flagged the unusual seat reassignment and forwarded a report to the Department of Homeland Security, where Agent Sarah Mitchell was just beginning to review some very interesting intelligence about defense contractor Bradley Ashworth and his wife Victoria, as Flight 847 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway. Victoria Ashworth had been sipping champagne and feeling like the natural order of the universe had been restored. She'd had no idea that she'd just set in motion a series of events that would destroy everything she'd spent 20 years building, and that the teenage boy whose dignity she'd trampled was about to become the catalyst for her complete and utter downfall. Captain James Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for Continental Airways for 23 years. And in all that time, he'd received exactly 4 phone calls from federal authorities that had required him to alter his flight plan. 3 of those calls had been false alarms involving passengers whose names had coincidentally matched people on various watch lists, situations that had been resolved with a few minutes of checking identification and a formal apology from the Transportation Security Administration. The 4th call was happening right now, 15 minutes after takeoff, as Flight 847 climbed through 28,000 feet over the lakes and forests of southern Michigan, and Captain Rodriguez could tell from the first 30 seconds of conversation that this was not going to be a false alarm. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Agent Sarah Mitchell from the Department of Homeland Security," the voice on his secure radio had said, cutting through the routine chatter between air traffic control and the dozens of aircraft crisscrossing the upper Midwest on this particular Thursday afternoon. "I need you to immediately return to Detroit Metropolitan Airport under federal emergency authority." Rodriguez had felt his stomach drop in the way it always did when something went wrong at 30,000 feet, that moment of professional adrenaline mixed with personal terror that reminded him that he was responsible for the lives of 237 people who had trusted him to get them safely from Detroit to Boston. "Agent Mitchell, can you tell me the nature of the emergency?" Do we have a security threat on board, Negative Captain? This is not a passenger threat situation. We have federal arrest warrants for 2 individuals on your aircraft, and due to flight risk concerns, we need them back on the ground immediately. We're coordinating with Detroit Approach Control to clear you for immediate return. Rodriguez had exchanged glances with his co-pilot Maria Santos, who had been listening to the entire conversation through her headset. In 23 years of flying, Rodriguez had never had federal agents request the return of an aircraft for passenger arrests, and something about the urgency in Agent Mitchell's voice suggested that whatever was happening involved more than just ordinary criminal activity. Agent Mitchell, can you tell me which passengers you're looking for? I need to know if there are any safety considerations for the crew. There had been a brief pause, then Bradley and Victoria Ashworth traveling in first class. Captain, I want to emphasize that these individuals are not considered dangerous to passengers or crew, but they are flight risks who were attempting to leave the country when our warrants cleared the federal system. Your aircraft was their planned method of escape. Rodriguez had felt a chill run down his spine as the implications of Agent Mitchell's words sank in. The Ashworths weren't just random criminals who had happened to book a flight. They were fugitives who had specifically chosen Flight 847 as part of an escape plan that federal authorities had only discovered at the last possible moment. Roger, Agent Mitchell. We're beginning our descent back to Detroit now. How long do you need us to hold at the gate? We'll have agents ready to board as soon as you arrive. This should be a quick operation, Captain. Thank you for your cooperation. As Rodriguez had begun the process of turning the massive aircraft around and requesting clearance for an immediate return to Detroit, he'd wondered what kind of crimes the Ashworths had committed that required such urgent federal intervention. He'd wondered if the other passengers had any idea that they were sharing their flight with people who were apparently serious enough criminals to warrant emergency action from the Department of Homeland Security. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Agent Mitchell was sitting in a secure conference room at the Federal Building in downtown Detroit, surrounded by file folders and computer screens displaying some of the most sensitive intelligence that had crossed her desk in 15 years with Homeland Security. The Ashworth investigation had been building for 8 months, ever since an anonymous tip from a disgruntled employee at Ashworth Defense Solutions had alerted federal authorities to irregularities in the company's handling of classified military contracts. The investigation had revealed that Bradley Ashworth had been systematically stealing technical specifications for advanced military drone technology and selling them to foreign governments through a network of shell companies and fake charitable organizations. But what had really captured federal attention was the discovery that Victoria Ashworth wasn't just a passive beneficiary of her husband's crimes. She was the mastermind who had designed the entire operation. Victoria had used her social connections and charity work as cover for an international arms-dealing network that had sold American military secrets to buyers in 12 different countries, including several that were officially considered enemies of the United States. The money laundering operation she'd constructed was so sophisticated that it had taken federal investigators 6 months just to understand how it worked, and the intelligence they'd gathered suggested that terrorist organizations in 3 different countries had used technology stolen by the Ashworths to build weapons that had killed American soldiers. The federal arrest warrants for the Ashworths had been signed by a judge just 45 minutes ago, and Agent Mitchell had been racing against time to prevent them from boarding an international flight out of Boston that would have taken them to a country without extradition treaties with the United States. The fact that Flight 847 had been delayed by 20 minutes due to what the airline had reported as a passenger seating dispute had given federal authorities just enough time to intercept the fugitives before they escaped American jurisdiction forever. Agent Mitchell had been working with Deputy Marshal Thomas Hayes and Agent Rivera from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division to coordinate the arrest operation, and all 3 of them were acutely aware that they had exactly 1 chance to get this right. If the Ashworths somehow managed to escape the intelligence they possessed about American military capabilities could end up in the hands of hostile governments within days. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Detroit Approach Control," the radio had crackled as Flight 847 descended through 15,000 feet. You are cleared for immediate approach to runway 3 left. Federal agents will meet your aircraft at gate 12. In the first-class cabin, Victoria Ashworth had been sipping her second glass of champagne and reading a fashion magazine, completely oblivious to the fact that her carefully planned escape was unraveling in real time. She'd been so focused on her triumph over the teenager who had dared to occupy her seat that she hadn't noticed her husband's increasingly frantic behavior, the way he kept checking his phone and wiping sweat from his forehead despite the airplane's cool temperature. Bradley Ashworth, unlike his wife, had been expecting this moment for weeks. He'd been monitoring federal law enforcement databases through contacts in the defense contractor community, and he'd known that it was only a matter of time before their operation was discovered. The plan had been to attend one final charity gala in Boston, then board a private jet to Switzerland, where numbered bank accounts and false identities would allow them to disappear forever. But the delayed takeoff had given federal authorities just enough time to obtain and process the arrest warrants, and now Bradley could feel the walls closing in around them with the inexorable force of gravity. He'd spent the first 20 minutes of the flight frantically texting contacts in 6 different countries, trying to arrange alternative escape routes, but it was too late. The careful house of cards he and Victoria had built over 2 decades was about to collapse, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. As Captain Rodriguez announced over the intercom that the flight was returning to Detroit due to a minor technical issue that required immediate attention, Victoria had finally looked up from her magazine with mild annoyance. "Really, Bradley," she'd said, taking another sip of champagne. "These airlines become less reliable every year. I hope this doesn't make us late for tomorrow's meeting." Bradley had looked at his wife, this woman who had been his partner in crime and his ticket to wealth beyond his wildest dreams, and he'd realized that she still didn't understand that there would be no meeting tomorrow, no Swiss bank accounts, no comfortable retirement in a country without extradition treaties. There would only be federal agents and handcuffs and the beginning of a legal process that would strip away everything they'd built and leave them with nothing but the consequences of their choices. The jetway connected to Flight 847, with the heavy mechanical thud of metal locking into metal, a sound that somehow managed to carry an ominous finality, even though it was exactly the same sound that occurred every time any airplane parked at any gate in any airport around the world. But for Deputy Marshal Thomas Hayes, who was standing just outside the aircraft door with his credentials in one hand and federal arrest warrants in the other, that metallic clang marked the end of an 8-month investigation and the beginning of what would probably be the most satisfying arrest of his 15-year career with the U.S. Marshals Service. Hayes was a 42-year-old father of 3 who had spent his entire adult life chasing people who thought they were smart enough to outrun federal law enforcement, and he'd developed a particular distaste for criminals who used their wealth and social status to hurt other people. The Ashworth case had everything he hated most about white-collar crime, arrogance, entitlement, and a complete disregard for the damage their actions caused to innocent people, including American soldiers, who had died because of technology that the Ashworths had sold to enemy governments. Standing beside Hayes was Agent Rivera from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, a woman whose calm exterior concealed 20 years of experience hunting spies and traitors who threatened American national security. Rivera had been tracking the flow of stolen military technology for months, following digital breadcrumbs across 4 continents and 12 different banking systems, and she'd personally reviewed classified reports about terrorist attacks that had used weapons built with Ashworth-supplied specifications. Both federal agents understood that they were about to arrest 2 people who had done more damage to American national security than most foreign spies, and they were looking forward to the moment when Bradley and Victoria Ashworth realized that their carefully planned escape had failed at the last possible second. The aircraft door opened with a soft hiss of pressurizing air, and Roger Martinez appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he realized that the federal agents boarding his aircraft weren't there for some routine security check. Hayes and Rivera stepped onto the plane with the confident stride of people who held badges that opened doors and ended conversations, their eyes immediately scanning the first-class cabin for their targets. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made conversations stop and heads turn. "We are federal agents conducting official business. Please remain in your seats and keep your hands visible." Victoria Ashworth looked up from her fashion magazine with the expression of someone who was mildly annoyed by an unexpected interruption, but not particularly concerned about its implications. She'd been dealing with minor inconveniences and service failures her entire life, and her first assumption was that this was just another example of airline incompetence that would be resolved with a few phone calls to the right people. "Excuse me, officers," Victoria had said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was used to having service personnel apologize for bothering her. "I think there's been some mistake. We're Platinum Medallion members and we have a connection to make in Boston. If you could just handle whatever this is quickly, we'd appreciate it." Hayes had looked at Victoria Ashworth, taking in her expensive clothing and her perfectly styled hair and her expression of absolute confidence that she was untouchable, and he'd felt the familiar satisfaction that came with proving people like her wrong. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth Hayes had asked, even though he already knew the answer. "Yes, and this is my husband Bradley." Now what seems to be the problem? Hayes had reached into his jacket and pulled out the federal arrest warrants, unfolding them with deliberate slowness. Victoria Ashworth Bradley. Ashworth, you are under arrest pursuant to federal warrants issued by the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. The silence that had followed Hayes's words had been absolute and profound, the kind of silence that occurs when reality suddenly shifts and people need a moment to process what they've just heard. Victoria had blinked several times, her magazine sliding off her lap onto the airplane's carpeted floor, while Bradley had begun hyperventilating with the rapid, shallow breathing of someone having a panic attack. "I'm sorry," what Victoria had asked, her voice rising in pitch as the implications of Hayes's words began to penetrate her shock. "Under arrest for what? This is ridiculous. Bradley, tell them who we are. Tell them about the foundation, about the charity work, about the gala tomorrow." Agent Rivera had stepped forward, her credentials clearly visible. "Mrs. Ashworth, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." "I don't need an attorney," Victoria had shrieked, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I need you people to stop making this terrible mistake and let us catch our connecting flight. Do you have any idea who my husband is? Do you know what kind of security clearances he holds?" Bradley had been trying to sink deeper into his first-class seat as if he could somehow become invisible through sheer force of will. His face had gone gray, and his hands were trembling as he pulled out his phone and began frantically deleting text messages and contacts, trying to destroy evidence, even as federal agents were literally standing over him. Mr. Ashworth, Agent Rivera, had said, her voice calm but implacable. "Please place your phone on the seat and put your hands behind your back." The wire transfers, Bradley had whispered, his voice barely audible. "Victoria, they know about the wire transfers." Victoria had spun around to stare at her husband, her confusion transforming into horror as she began to understand that this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or bureaucratic incompetence, but rather the inevitable consequence of choices they'd made over many years. "What wire transfers?" Victoria had demanded. "Bradley, what are you talking about?" But before Bradley could answer, Deputy Marshal Hayes had produced a pair of handcuffs and stepped toward Victoria's seat. "Ma'am, I need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back." "I am not doing anything of the sort," Victoria had declared, gripping the armrests of her first-class seat as if she could prevent her arrest through pure stubbornness. "I don't know what kind of mistake this is, but I am not getting up until someone explains to me what's happening." Hayes had dealt with resistant arrestees before, and he'd learned that there was no point in arguing with people who were convinced that their wealth or status or social connections could protect them from the consequences of federal crimes. "Ma'am, you can stand up voluntarily or I can assist you. Either way, you're coming with us." "Assist me." Victoria had laughed a high-pitched sound that contained no humor whatsoever. "You cannot be serious. Do you people have any idea what kind of lawsuit you're setting yourselves up for? Bradley, call Senator Morrison. Call the governor. Call someone who can put a stop to this insanity." But Bradley hadn't been calling anyone because he'd been too busy watching his entire life collapse in real time. For months, he'd been living with the knowledge that their operation was being investigated, that federal agents were closing in on them, that it was only a matter of time before their carefully constructed facade came crashing down. He'd tried to convince Victoria that they needed to be more careful, that they needed to start planning exit strategies, but she'd been so confident in her own invulnerability that she'd refused to believe they were in any real danger. Judge Helen Washington, who had been sitting in seat 1B and watching this entire drama unfold, with the professional interest of someone who had spent 30 years presiding over federal criminal trials, had finally decided to speak up. Officer Judge Washington had said, addressing Deputy Marshal Hayes with the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of commanding courtrooms. Retired federal judge Helen Washington: "I've been observing this entire situation, and I want you to know that I'm prepared to serve as a witness regarding these individuals' behavior prior to your arrival." Hayes had looked at the elderly black woman with surprise and respect. "Your Honor, thank you. We may indeed need your testimony." What behavior, Victoria had demanded, looking back and forth between Hayes and Judge Washington. "What are you talking about? I haven't done anything wrong." "We haven't done anything wrong except try to fly to Boston for a charity event." Judge Washington had fixed Victoria with the kind of stare that had been reducing criminal defendants to puddles of sweat for 3 decades. "Mrs. Ashworth, I personally witnessed you force a 17-year-old black student out of his legitimately assigned seat through intimidation and racial prejudice. I have detailed notes about everything you said and did." Victoria had stared at Judge Washington with dawning horror as she began to understand that her confrontation with Damon Rivers hadn't been the private victory she'd thought it was, but rather a public humiliation that had been witnessed and documented by someone with the authority and credibility to hold her accountable. "That has nothing to do with whatever this is about," Victoria had protested weakly. "That was just a seating dispute. Airlines make mistakes all the time." "The airline didn't make a mistake," Mrs. Ashworth Agent Rivera had said, consulting her notes. "Our investigation shows that Damon Rivers was legitimately upgraded due to economy overbooking. You forced him to give up his seat through intimidation and discriminatory harassment. And because your tantrum delayed the flight's departure by 23 minutes, our arrest warrants had time to clear the federal system before you could escape to Boston." The full implications of what Agent Rivera had said hit Victoria like a physical blow, and she'd sagged in her seat as she realized that her own racism and entitlement had directly contributed to her capture. "You mean," Victoria had whispered, "if I had just sat in 2A, you'd probably be halfway to Switzerland by now," Hayes had confirmed. "But you couldn't let a black teenager have something you wanted, and that decision just cost you your freedom." Agent Sarah Mitchell had been coordinating the Ashworth arrest from a secure command center at the federal building in Detroit, monitoring radio communications between the aircraft and ground personnel, while simultaneously reviewing the mountain of evidence that federal investigators had compiled over 8 months of surveillance and financial analysis. As Deputy Marshal Hayes and Agent Rivera had been placing the Ashworths under arrest, Mitchell had been preparing for the next phase of the operation, securing the evidence that would ensure these traitors spent the rest of their lives in federal prison. The Ashworth investigation had begun with an anonymous tip from someone inside Ashworth Defense Solutions. someone who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with irregularities in the company's handling of classified military contracts and had finally worked up the courage to contact federal authorities. That single phone call had launched an investigation that had uncovered one of the most damaging espionage operations in recent American history, a network of corruption that had sold military secrets to hostile governments and terrorist organizations around the world. Federal investigators had discovered that Bradley Ashworth had been using his security clearances to systematically steal technical specifications for advanced military drone technology, guided missile systems, and encrypted communication protocols that formed the backbone of American military superiority. But what had truly shocked federal authorities was the revelation that Victoria Ashworth hadn't just been a passive beneficiary of her husband's crimes. She had been the architect of the entire operation. Victoria had designed an elaborate money laundering scheme that used charitable foundations and social organizations as fronts for international arms dealing. The donations that poured into these fake charities were actually payments from foreign buyers, and the administrative expenses that got transferred to offshore accounts were actually profits from selling American military secrets to enemies of the United States. The evidence against the Ashworths was overwhelming, and irrefutable bank records showing millions of dollars in suspicious transfers, encrypted communication logs, detailing negotiations with foreign agents, shipping manifests for packages containing classified documents, and surveillance footage of meetings between Victoria and representatives of terrorist organizations in 6 different countries. But perhaps the most damning evidence was the detailed confession that federal investigators had obtained from Marcus Webb, a former Ashworth employee who had been recruited to serve as a courier for stolen documents but had become increasingly uncomfortable with the operation's scope and ultimate purposes. Webb had agreed to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for immunity from prosecution, and his testimony provided prosecutors with an insider's view of how the Ashworth operation had functioned and who had been responsible for its most damaging aspects. According to Webb's statement, Victoria Ashworth had been the undisputed leader of the criminal enterprise, making all major decisions about which information to steal, which buyers to cultivate, and how to structure transactions to avoid detection by federal authorities. Bradley had been essentially a junior partner in his own company, following his wife's orders and providing access to classified materials, while Victoria had handled the business aspects of their treason. The investigation had also revealed that the Ashworths' activities had directly resulted in the deaths of American soldiers and intelligence operatives around the world. Terrorist organizations in Afghanistan had used Ashworth-supplied technology to build improvised explosive devices that had killed dozens of American troops, while hostile governments had used stolen communication protocols to intercept and decode American military transmissions, compromising operations and endangering personnel. As federal agents had been arresting the Ashworths on Flight 847. Other teams had been simultaneously executing search warrants at their home in Bloomfield Hills, their offices at Ashworth Defense Solutions, and safety deposit boxes in 3 different banks, where they had hidden additional evidence of their crimes. The coordinated operation was designed to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of co-conspirators who might have been monitoring law enforcement activities. Judge Helen Washington had remained in her seat during the arrest, taking detailed notes and preparing to serve as a witness not only to the discrimination she had observed, but also to the Ashworths' behavior when confronted with federal agents. As someone who had presided over hundreds of criminal trials, Judge Washington understood the importance of credible testimony about defendants' state of mind and consciousness of guilt. Agent Judge Washington had said to Hayes as Victoria was being handcuffed, "I want to make sure you're aware that Mrs. Ashworth made several statements during her confrontation with young Mr. Rivers that suggested a pattern of discriminatory thinking that might be relevant to your investigation." Hayes had looked at Judge Washington with interest. "What kind of statements, Your Honor?" She repeatedly referred to the young man's perceived social class and questioned whether people like him belonged in first class. She also made references to his race that were clearly intended to justify her belief that he didn't deserve equal treatment. This suggests a mindset that divides people into categories of who deserves respect and consideration, which might be relevant to how she justified selling military secrets to foreign governments. Agent Rivera had nodded thoughtfully. "That's very helpful. Your Honor, we've been trying to understand how someone born and raised in America could justify committing treason, and a pattern of seeing certain groups of people as inherently less deserving might explain how she rationalized helping our enemies." As the Ashworths had been led off the aircraft in handcuffs, other passengers had begun to realize that they had just witnessed something far more significant than a routine arrest. Marcus Webb, the investigative journalist who had been sitting in seat 3C and filming the entire discrimination incident with his phone, had immediately understood the historical importance of what he had captured on video. Webb's footage showed not only Victoria Ashworth's racist harassment of Damon Rivers, but also her complete breakdown when confronted with federal agents, her desperate attempts to use her social status to avoid arrest, and her growing realization that the very prejudices that had driven her to humiliate a black teenager had also contributed to her capture by federal authorities. The video would eventually become crucial evidence in the federal prosecution of the Ashworths, providing prosecutors with documented proof of Victoria's character and mindset that would help explain to a jury how someone could justify betraying their own country for money. But more immediately, the video would become a viral sensation that would spark a national conversation about the connections between everyday racism and more serious forms of moral corruption. As Flight 847 finally departed Detroit for Boston, nearly 3 hours behind schedule, the remaining passengers had found themselves part of a story that would dominate news cycles for months to come. They had witnessed the intersection of casual prejudice and international espionage, the moment when a routine act of discrimination had become the catalyst for exposing one of the most damaging spy rings in American history. Damon Rivers, still sitting in row 31 between the businessman with the tuna sandwich and the young mother with the crying baby, had no idea that his quiet dignity in the face of humiliation had already made him a hero to millions of people who would soon see Marcus Webb's video. He also had no idea that Victoria Ashworth's decision to steal his seat had directly contributed to her arrest and the prevention of further damage to American national security. All Damon knew was that he had been treated unfairly by adults who were supposed to know better, and that he had chosen to respond with grace and dignity rather than anger and confrontation. He had no way of knowing that his choice would soon inspire a generation of young people to stand up for justice while maintaining their humanity, or that his name would become synonymous with the power of moral courage in the face of institutional prejudice. Marcus Webb had been working as an investigative journalist for the Detroit Free Press for 12 years, specializing in corporate corruption and government accountability stories that required months of research and dozens of interviews to piece together complex patterns of misconduct and abuse. But as he sat in the Detroit Metro Airport terminal uploading video files to his newspaper's servers, Webb realized that he had just captured the most important story of his career in real time, using nothing more than his iPhone and the journalistic instincts that had told him to keep recording, even when the situation on Flight 847 had escalated beyond a simple passenger dispute. The video Webb had filmed was extraordinary, not just because it documented a clear case of racial discrimination, but because it showed the exact moment when everyday prejudice had intersected with international espionage in a way that revealed fundamental truths about how corruption and bigotry fed off each other in American society. Victoria Ashworth's treatment of Damon Rivers had been a perfect microcosm of the entitled mindset that had allowed her to justify selling military secrets to enemy governments, and Webb's footage captured that connection with devastating clarity. Webb had immediately recognized the newsworthiness of what he had witnessed, but he had also understood that this story required careful handling to ensure that Damon Rivers was protected from the media circus that would inevitably follow. The teenager had already been through enough humiliation for one day, and Webb was determined that his reporting would focus on holding powerful people accountable rather than exploiting a young victim's pain for clicks and views. The first version of Webb's story had gone live on the Detroit Free Press website at 4:47 p.m. Eastern Time, just 2 hours after Flight 847 had returned to Detroit and the Ashworths had been taken into federal custody. The headline read, "Racist First-Class Tantrum Leads to Arrest of Defense Contractor Couple on Espionage Charges," and within minutes of publication, the article was being shared across social media platforms at a rate that overwhelmed the newspaper's servers. By 6:00 p.m., the video had been viewed more than 2 million times on various platforms, and hashtag Justice for Damon was trending on Twitter alongside hashtag Ashworth Arrests and hashtag Airline Discrimination. The story was being picked up by major news networks, cable news shows, and international media outlets that were fascinated by the seemingly impossible connection between a teenager's humiliation and the exposure of a major spy ring. Cable news networks had immediately recognized the story's potential to capture public attention and drive ratings, and by 7:00 p.m., every major network was running segments about the first-class incident that exposed espionage. CNN had booked retired FBI counterintelligence agents to explain how the Ashworths' operation had worked while MSNBC was focusing on the discrimination aspect of the story and the broader patterns of prejudice that allowed people like Victoria Ashworth to dehumanize anyone they perceived as inferior. Fox News had initially tried to downplay the discrimination angle and focus solely on the espionage charges, but even their commentators had been forced to acknowledge that Victoria Ashworth's behavior toward Damon Rivers had been indefensible, and that her racist assumptions had directly contributed to her capture by federal authorities. The social media response had been immediate and overwhelming, with millions of people sharing their own experiences of discrimination in public spaces, while expressing admiration for Damon Rivers' dignity and composure under pressure. The teenager's name had become a rallying cry for people who had experienced similar treatment, but had never seen their tormentors face meaningful consequences. Angela Rivers. Damon's mother had been finishing a 12-hour shift in the intensive care unit at Detroit Medical Center when her phone had started buzzing with notifications from reporters, producers, and activists who wanted to interview her about her son's experience. At first, she had assumed that Damon had gotten into some kind of trouble during his flight, and she had been preparing to deal with whatever crisis had befallen her normally well-behaved teenager. But when she had finally had a chance to watch Marcus Webb's video during her break, Angela had been simultaneously proud of her son's grace under pressure and furious at the adults who had failed to protect him from Victoria Ashworth's racist harassment. As a black woman who had worked in predominantly white professional environments her entire career, Angela understood exactly what her son had experienced and why he had chosen to handle the situation with quiet dignity rather than confrontation. "I raised Damon to understand that he would face situations like this throughout his life," Angela had told the CNN producer who had finally reached her by phone. "I taught him to respond with intelligence and character, not because that's what he owed to people who mistreated him, but because that's who he is as a person. I'm proud that he maintained his dignity, but I'm angry that he was put in a position where he had to prove his humanity to adults who should have known better." The interview requests had been pouring in from around the world, with producers from the BBC-CBC and major European networks wanting to speak with both Damon and his mother about the incident and its broader implications. But Angela had been careful about which interviews to accept, working with a civil rights attorney who had volunteered to represent the family pro bono to ensure that media coverage remained focused on the important issues rather than sensationalizing her son's trauma. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Secretary of Transportation, had issued a statement announcing that the Department of Transportation would be conducting a comprehensive review of airline policies regarding passenger treatment and seat assignments, with particular attention to preventing discriminatory practices that violated federal civil rights laws. The announcement had sent shockwaves through the airline industry as executives realized that the Ashworth incident could trigger regulatory changes that would fundamentally alter how they handled customer service disputes. Continental Airways had found itself in the impossible position of trying to defend the indefensible as corporate executives struggled to explain why their employees had allowed a paying customer to be humiliated and displaced based solely on the complaints of another passenger. The airline's initial statement, which had attempted to characterize the incident as a misunderstanding about seating assignments, had been immediately contradicted by Marcus Webb's video evidence and Judge Helen Washington's eyewitness testimony. Within 24 hours of the incident, Continental Airways had fired lead flight attendant Roger Martinez and placed flight attendant Patricia Walsh on administrative leave pending a full investigation of their decision-making during the confrontation. The airline had also announced that they were implementing immediate changes to their customer service training programs and policies regarding seat reassignments, though critics argued that these measures were too little too late. The stock market had responded to the Continental Airways scandal with predictable severity as investors realized that the airline faced potential lawsuits, federal regulatory action, and a consumer boycott that could cost millions of dollars in lost revenue. Continental's stock price had dropped by 18% in the first day of trading after the incident, and industry analysts were predicting that the company's reputation might never fully recover from the damage caused by their employees' decision to enable Victoria Ashworth's racist harassment. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the media explosion surrounding the Ashworth incident was the way it had connected seemingly unrelated issues of everyday discrimination and national security threats, forcing Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about how prejudice and corruption reinforced each other in their society. Editorial writers and political commentators across the ideological spectrum had begun exploring the connections between Victoria Ashworth's casual racism and her willingness to betray her country for money, arguing that both behaviors stemmed from the same fundamental disregard for the humanity and dignity of other people. 6 months after flight, 847 had returned to Detroit with federal agents boarding to arrest the Ashworths, the case of United States versus. Bradley Ashworth and Victoria Ashworth had become one of the most closely watched federal prosecutions in recent memory, combining elements of espionage, corruption, and civil rights violations in a way that captured public attention and legal precedent in equal measure. Lead prosecutor Amanda Foster had been handpicked by the Justice Department to handle the case based on her 15-year track record of successfully prosecuting complex white-collar crimes and her specific expertise in cases involving national security violations. Foster understood that the Ashworth prosecution would be about more than just securing convictions. It would be about sending a clear message that Americans who sold military secrets to enemy governments would face the full force of federal law enforcement, regardless of their wealth or social status. The evidence against the Ashworths was overwhelming and multifaceted, including financial records that traced millions of dollars in suspicious transactions, surveillance footage of meetings with foreign agents, encrypted communications detailing negotiations with terrorist organizations, and testimony from multiple cooperating witnesses who had participated in various aspects of the criminal enterprise. But Foster also understood that the discrimination incident involving Damon Rivers would play a crucial role in the prosecution, not just as evidence of Victoria Ashworth's character, but as a window into the mindset that had allowed her to justify betraying her country. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Foster had said during her opening statement, "this case is about two people who believed that their wealth and status placed them above the law, above common decency, and above their fundamental obligations as American citizens. You will hear evidence that the defendants sold military secrets to terrorist organizations that used those secrets to build weapons that killed American soldiers. But you will also see evidence of how that same sense of entitlement manifested in their everyday interactions with people they considered beneath them. The prosecution's strategy had been to present the Ashworths' crimes in the broader context of their character and values, using the Flight 847 incident as a lens through which the jury could understand how people capable of casual cruelty toward a 17-year-old student were also capable of selling military secrets that would be used to kill American troops. Foster had spent months preparing Damon Rivers to testify about his experience working with victim advocates to ensure that the teenager would be able to tell his story clearly and powerfully without being re-traumatized by the legal process. Damon's testimony had been scheduled for the third day of the trial after prosecutors had established the basic facts of the espionage conspiracy. But before they delved into the technical details of which specific military secrets had been sold and how they had been used by hostile governments, Foster understood that Damon's story would humanize the case for the jury, helping them understand that the defendant's crimes weren't abstract violations of national security law, but rather the inevitable result of a worldview that treated other people as disposable. Judge Helen Washington had also been called as a prosecution witness, and her testimony had provided crucial credibility to the government's case. As a retired federal judge with 30 years of experience presiding over criminal trials, Judge Washington's account of Victoria Ashworth's behavior carried enormous weight with the jury, and her detailed notes from the incident had provided prosecutors with a contemporaneous record of everything that had happened on Flight 847. I have presided over thousands of criminal cases during my career. Judge Washington had testified, and I have learned to recognize the difference between people who make mistakes under pressure and people who reveal their true character when they think no one important is watching. Mrs. Ashworth's treatment of young Mr. Rivers was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate expression of beliefs about which human beings matter and which human beings don't. The defense team representing the Ashworths had faced an almost impossible task, trying to convince a jury to show mercy to defendants who had sold military secrets to terrorist organizations, while also demonstrating racist prejudice toward a teenage student on national television. Defense attorney Robert Sterling had initially attempted to argue that his clients were not the masterminds of the espionage operation, but rather junior participants who had been manipulated by more sophisticated foreign agents. But that defense strategy had collapsed when Bradley Ashworth had decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed testimony about how Victoria had designed and managed the entire criminal enterprise, while he had served as essentially a well-paid courier with security clearances. Bradley's testimony had been devastating to his wife's defense, as he had described in excruciating detail how Victoria had recruited buyers, negotiated prices, arranged transfers of classified documents, and laundered the proceeds through fake charitable organizations. Victoria was always the smart one, Bradley had testified, avoiding eye contact with his wife at the defense table. She understood how to manipulate people, how to exploit social connections for criminal purposes, how to hide illegal activities behind legitimate-looking organizations. I just did what she told me to do and provided access to the classified information she needed. Victoria's defense team had then shifted to arguing that their client was not responsible for how foreign buyers used the information they purchased, and that she had believed she was selling technology to legitimate governments rather than terrorist organizations. But that argument had been undermined by encrypted communications that prosecutors had recovered from Victoria's computer's communications that clearly showed her discussing how stolen American military secrets would be used to target American troops and intelligence operatives. Perhaps most damaging to Victoria's defense had been her decision to take the witness stand in her own defense, a decision that had allowed prosecutors to cross-examine her about both her espionage activities and her treatment of Damon Rivers. Foster had spent weeks preparing for that cross-examination, understanding that it would be her opportunity to show the jury exactly who Victoria Ashworth really was when she thought she could get away with hurting other people. The federal courthouse in downtown Detroit had been packed to capacity every day of the Ashworth trial, with overflow crowds watching the proceedings on closed-circuit television in adjoining courtrooms and hundreds of reporters from around the world covering every development in a case that had captured international attention. But on the day when Victoria Ashworth was scheduled to take the witness stand in her own defense, the atmosphere in the courtroom had been charged with an electricity that everyone present could feel. Victoria had spent the previous 6 months in federal custody, and the experience had clearly taken its toll on her appearance and demeanor. Gone were the expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair that had been her armor against the world. In their place were a modest gray suit provided by her attorney and hair that showed gray roots and stress-induced thinning. But despite her diminished circumstances, Victoria had retained the fundamental arrogance that had driven her to believe she could sell military secrets to terrorist organizations without facing consequences. Defense attorney Robert Sterling had spent hours preparing Victoria for her testimony, coaching her to appear remorseful and cooperative while avoiding admissions that would strengthen the government's case. Sterling understood that his client's only hope for avoiding a life sentence was to convince the jury that she had been manipulated by more sophisticated foreign agents and that she had never intended for her actions to harm American military personnel. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling had begun. Can you tell the jury about your charitable work and your commitment to helping disadvantaged communities? Victoria had launched into a prepared speech about the various philanthropic organizations she had supported over the years, describing herself as a devoted advocate for education and poverty reduction, who had simply gotten in over her head when foreign contacts had approached her about legitimate technology transfers. She had spoken about her work with literacy programs and scholarship funds, painting herself as a woman whose good intentions had been exploited by criminal masterminds. But prosecutor Amanda Foster had been waiting for months for the opportunity to cross-examine Victoria Ashworth, and she had come prepared with evidence that would systematically destroy every aspect of the defendant's carefully constructed defense. Foster understood that Victoria's testimony about her charitable work provided the perfect opening to introduce evidence about how those same organizations had been used to launder money from arms deals. Mrs. Ashworth Foster had begun. You've testified about your charitable work, but isn't it true that the organizations you've described were actually fronts for money laundering operations? That's absolutely false, Victoria had replied, her voice rising in indignation. I have devoted my life to helping people who are less fortunate than I am. Foster had then introduced financial records showing how donations to Victoria's charities had actually come from foreign intelligence services and how administrative expenses had been transferred to offshore accounts controlled by the Ashworths. The evidence had been overwhelming and indisputable, showing that Victoria's charitable work had been nothing more than cover for international arms dealing. But Foster's most devastating line of questioning had focused on the Flight 847 incident, using Marcus Webb's video to show the jury exactly how Victoria treated people she considered beneath her when she thought no one important was watching. Mrs. Ashworth, I'd like to show you some video footage from Flight 847 and ask you to explain your behavior to the jury. The courtroom screens had filled with images from Webb's video showing Victoria's confrontation with Damon Rivers in excruciating detail. The jury had watched Victoria demand that a 17-year-old student give up his legitimately assigned seat, had heard her make racist assumptions about his background and qualifications, and had seen her celebration when airline employees had forced him to move to the back of the plane. Mrs. Ashworth, can you explain to the jury why you believed you had the right to force this young man out of his assigned seat? Victoria had tried to minimize the incident, claiming that it had been a simple misunderstanding about airline policies and that her behavior had been justified by her medical needs and frequent flyer status. But Foster had been relentless in her questioning, forcing Victoria to confront the racism and entitlement that had driven her actions. Isn't it true, Mrs. Ashworth, that you assumed this young man didn't belong in first class because of his race and his appearance? That's not true, Victoria had protested. I was simply trying to resolve a seating mix-up. Mrs. Ashworth, Let's listen to your exact words from the video. Foster had played the audio of Victoria's comments about Damon Rivers, including her references to people like him and her assumptions about his social class and background. The jury had listened in stunned silence as they heard Victoria's voice dripping with contempt and prejudice, making it clear that her treatment of the teenager had been motivated by racism rather than any legitimate concern about airline policies. Mrs. Ashworth, if you could treat a 17-year-old American student with such cruelty and disrespect, how can this jury believe that you felt any loyalty or concern for American soldiers who might be killed by weapons built with technology you sold to terrorist organizations? Victoria had begun to lose her composure under Foster's relentless questioning, her voice rising and her face flushing as she tried to defend actions that were clearly indefensible. She had started making statements that contradicted her earlier testimony, admitting that she had known some of her buyers were connected to terrorist organizations, but claiming that she had believed the technology would be used for defensive rather than offensive purposes. But Victoria's complete breakdown had come when Foster had introduced evidence showing that terrorist organizations in Afghanistan had used Ashworth-supplied technology to build improvised explosive devices that had killed dozens of American soldiers. As Foster had displayed photographs of young soldiers who had died in attacks involving Ashworth-supplied technology, Victoria had finally snapped. Those soldiers knew what they were signing up for when they joined the military. Victoria had shouted, her composure finally completely shattered. They chose to put themselves in harm's way, and if they got killed, that's the risk they accepted. I didn't force anyone to become a soldier. The silence that had followed Victoria's outburst had been absolute and profound as everyone in the courtroom processed what they had just heard. Victoria Ashworth, who had spent hours testifying about her patriotism and her charitable work, had just told a federal jury that she felt no responsibility for the deaths of American soldiers who had been killed by weapons built with technology she had sold to their enemies. Judge Margaret Chen had immediately called for a recess, but the damage had been done. Victoria's mask had finally slipped, completely revealing the cold, calculating person who could justify selling military secrets to terrorist organizations and forcing a teenager out of his airplane seat with equal indifference to human suffering. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against both defendants. Victoria Ashworth had been convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage, money laundering, violation of the Arms Export Control Act, and civil rights violations, while Bradley had been convicted on the same charges, but with credit for his cooperation with federal authorities. As the verdicts had been read, Victoria had remained stone-faced and defiant, showing no remorse for her crimes or acknowledgement of the damage she had caused to American national security and the lives of individual soldiers who had died because of her actions. She had maintained her arrogance and entitlement even in the face of certain conviction and life imprisonment, unable to accept that her wealth and status couldn't protect her from the consequences of betraying her country. 1 year after the verdicts in United States versus Bradley Ashworth and Victoria Ashworth had made headlines around the world. The reverberations from that extraordinary case continued to reshape American conversations about justice, accountability, and the connections between everyday prejudice and larger forms of corruption. Victoria had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, while Bradley had received 15 years with credit for his cooperation, and both of them were serving their sentences in maximum security facilities where they would have ample time to contemplate the choices that had led them from suburban respectability to federal prison cells. The investigation that had begun with the Ashworth arrests had expanded far beyond their individual crimes, triggering a comprehensive federal review of security clearance procedures, defense contractor oversight, and the regulation of charitable organizations that could be used as fronts for money laundering operations. The Department of Justice had created a new task force specifically focused on preventing the kind of espionage operation that the Ashworths had managed to run for nearly a decade, and Congress had passed legislation strengthening penalties for Americans who sold military secrets to foreign governments. But perhaps the most significant changes had occurred in the airline industry, where the discrimination against Damon Rivers had prompted a complete overhaul of customer service policies and civil rights training programs. The Department of Transportation had implemented what became known as the Rivers Protocol, a set of federal regulations that prohibited airlines from removing passengers from assigned seats without documented safety or security justifications, and that required extensive documentation and review of any seating changes that occurred after passengers had boarded aircraft. Continental Airways had faced the full consequences of their employees' decision to enable Victoria Ashworth's racist harassment, paying a multi-million-dollar settlement to Damon Rivers and his family, while also agreeing to implement comprehensive civil rights training for all customer-facing employees. The airline had also established the Rivers Scholarship Program, providing full college funding for 50 students annually, who demonstrated both academic excellence and commitment to fighting discrimination in their communities. Roger Martinez, the lead flight attendant who had forced Damon to give up his seat, had been terminated by Continental Airways and had faced federal civil rights charges for his role in the discrimination. He had ultimately pleaded guilty to violating Damon's civil rights under color of his authority as an airline employee and had been sentenced to community service and mandatory training on civil rights law and unconscious bias recognition. Damon Rivers, now 18 years old and a freshman at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had used his unexpected fame to become a powerful advocate for civil rights and educational opportunity, speaking at universities and conferences around the world about the importance of maintaining dignity and humanity in the face of prejudice and injustice. The scholarship money from the Continental Airways settlement, combined with donations from supporters around the world, had allowed him to establish the Dignity and Justice Foundation, an organization focused on providing educational opportunities for young people who had experienced discrimination. "I never wanted to become famous for being mistreated," Damon had said during a speech at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, addressing an audience of students, activists, and political leaders who had come to hear him speak about his experience. "But since that's what happened, I've tried to use this platform to make sure that other young people know they don't have to accept being treated as less than human, and that they can respond to injustice with strength and grace rather than bitterness and anger." Angela Rivers had also become a prominent voice in discussions about discrimination and accountability, using her experience as Damon's mother to advocate for stronger protections for young people who faced prejudice in schools, workplaces, and public accommodations. She had been promoted to Chief of Nursing at Detroit Medical Center and had used her platform in healthcare to push for more inclusive policies and better training for medical professionals who worked with diverse patient populations. Judge Helen Washington had come out of retirement to serve on a federal task force, examining the connections between individual prejudice and institutional discrimination, drawing on her decades of experience in federal courts to help develop new approaches to civil rights enforcement that addressed both overt discrimination and the more subtle forms of bias that allowed systems of inequality to persist. Her witnessing of the Flight 847 incident had provided her with a perfect case study of how everyday racism intersected with larger patterns of entitlement and moral corruption. Marcus Webb, the investigative journalist whose video had captured the Flight 847 incident and its aftermath, had won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the Ashworth case and its broader implications for American society. His book about the intersection of racism and corruption, titled First-Class Citizens: How Everyday Prejudice Enables Extraordinary Crimes, had become a bestseller and required reading in law schools and civil rights programs around the country. The international intelligence community had also been fundamentally changed by the exposure of the Ashworth operation, as security services around the world had been forced to confront the reality that wealthy, respected citizens could be turned into effective espionage assets through nothing more complicated than greed and a sense of entitlement that placed their personal desires above their national loyalty. New security protocols had been implemented for defense contractors with access to classified information, and intelligence agencies had developed improved methods for detecting the kind of long-term penetration operation that the Ashworths had represented. But beyond all the policy changes and legal reforms and institutional adaptations, the Ashworth case had sparked a deeper conversation in American society about the connections between how people treated each other in everyday interactions and how they approached larger questions of justice and responsibility. Victoria Ashworth's journey from racist airplane passenger to convicted spy had forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about how prejudice and corruption fed off each other, and how individual acts of cruelty could be symptoms of much larger moral failures. On a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after Flight 847 had returned to Detroit with federal agents boarding to arrest the Ashworths, Damon Rivers found himself walking through Boston, Logan International Airport toward the gate for Continental Airways Flight 233 to Detroit, carrying the same worn backpack with its collection of aerospace patches that had accompanied him on that life-changing journey from Phoenix to Detroit. But everything else about Damon's circumstances had been transformed by the events of that extraordinary day, and as he moved through the terminal, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the worst that prejudice and cruelty could offer and had emerged stronger and more determined to fight for justice in the world. Damon was now a sophomore at MIT, studying aerospace engineering, with a focus on developing new technologies that could be used for peaceful exploration rather than military applications. And he had become one of the most sought-after speakers on college campuses around the country, sharing his story and inspiring other young people to stand up for justice while maintaining their humanity and dignity. The Dignity and Justice Foundation that he had established with the settlement money from Continental Airways had already provided scholarships to more than 200 students who had faced discrimination, and the organization had become a powerful force for change in communities around the world. As Damon approached the Continental Airways check-in counter, he was immediately recognized by the customer service representative, a young black woman named Keisha, who had been hired as part of the airline's comprehensive diversity and inclusion initiative that had been implemented in the wake of the Flight 847 incident. Mr. Rivers, Keisha had said with a genuine smile, "It's such an honor to meet you. I actually applied to work for Continental specifically because of the changes they made after what happened to you, and I want to thank you for standing up for all of us who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." Damon had been upgraded to first class automatically as part of the lifetime courtesy status that Continental Airways had granted him as part of their settlement agreement. But as he walked toward the gate, he found himself thinking about all the young people who were still facing discrimination in airports and airplanes and schools and workplaces around the world. His experience had led to important changes in airline policies and federal regulations, but he understood that the deeper work of changing hearts and minds was something that would require sustained effort over many years. As he boarded the aircraft and walked toward seat 1, Damon noticed a commotion near the back of the first-class cabin where a flight attendant was speaking in hushed tones to a young Latina girl who appeared to be traveling alone and looked frightened and confused. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 13 years old, was clutching a violin case and a boarding pass while tears streamed down her face. "Excuse me," Damon had said to the flight attendant. "Is there some kind of problem I can help with?" The flight attendant, whose name tag read Maria, had looked at Damon with recognition and relief. "Mr. Rivers, thank you. This is Sophia Martinez, and she's traveling to Detroit for an audition with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra youth program. Her ticket shows seat 2A, but another passenger is claiming that there's been some kind of mistake with the booking." Damon had looked toward seat 2A, where he saw a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit who was arguing loudly with another flight attendant about his platinum status and his legitimate right to the seat that had been assigned to him. The man's voice and demeanor were unnervingly similar to Victoria Ashworth's on that day 2 years ago, and Damon felt a familiar knot of anger in his stomach as he realized that Sophia was about to be victimized by the same kind of entitled prejudice that he had experienced. But instead of anger, Damon felt a calm sense of purpose wash over him as he realized that he was in a position to make sure that Sophia Martinez would not have to experience the humiliation and degradation that he had endured. He had learned from his experience on Flight 847 that the most powerful response to prejudice was not confrontation or conflict, but rather quiet determination and strategic action that protected victims while holding perpetrators accountable. Sophia Damon had said, kneeling down so that he was at eye level with the frightened girl, "My name is Damon Rivers, and I'm going to make sure that everything works out fine for you. You have a right to sit in your assigned seat, and no one is going to make you give it up." Damon had then walked over to seat 2A, where the angry passenger was still berating the flight attendant about his status and his rights, and had introduced himself with the kind of calm authority that came from having faced down much worse situations than this. Sir Damon had said, "I'm Damon Rivers, and I think you might remember my name from some news stories about discrimination on Continental Airways flights. I want you to know that I'm personally monitoring this situation, and if you continue to harass this young girl about her legitimately assigned seat, I will make sure that your behavior becomes as famous as mine did." The man had looked at Damon with dawning recognition and growing alarm as he realized that he was about to become the subject of the kind of viral video that could destroy careers and reputations overnight. Without another word, he had gathered his belongings and moved to an empty seat in row 4, while Sophia had settled into seat 2A with her violin case and a grateful smile that reminded Damon why his work with the Dignity and Justice Foundation was so important. As Flight 233 had taken off from Boston and climbed into the clear October sky, Damon had looked out the window at the New England landscape below and thought about how much his life had changed since that day when Victoria Ashworth had forced him out of seat 1A. He had discovered that individual acts of courage and dignity could create ripple effects that changed policies and institutions and inspired other people to stand up for justice in their own communities. But, more importantly, he had learned that the most powerful response to hatred and prejudice was not hatred in return, but rather the kind of love and determination that insisted on treating every human being with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or class or status or background. Sophia Martinez would arrive in Detroit that afternoon for her audition with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra Youth Program, and she would pursue her musical dreams without having to carry the trauma of being humiliated by an adult who thought she didn't deserve equal treatment. Victoria Ashworth began serving her 25-year federal sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, where she quickly discovered that her former wealth and social status meant nothing to fellow inmates who viewed her as a traitor who had sold military secrets to enemies of the United States. She filed numerous appeals challenging her conviction and sentence, but federal courts consistently rejected her claims, finding that the evidence against her had been overwhelming and that her sentence was appropriate given the scope of her crimes and her complete lack of remorse. The Rivers Foundation that Damon had established continued to grow and expand its mission, providing scholarships to more than 500 students annually, while also funding research into the psychological and social factors that enabled discrimination and prejudice to persist in American institutions. The Foundation's work had influenced federal policy on civil rights enforcement and had inspired similar organizations around the world to adopt Damon's approach of responding to injustice with dignity and determination rather than bitterness and anger. Damon's story became a standard case study in law schools and business programs around the country, where students analyzed the Flight 847 incident as an example of how individual courage could expose institutional failures and create lasting change that protected future victims of discrimination. His example had inspired a generation of young activists who understood that the most powerful response to prejudice was not confrontation, but rather the kind of moral clarity that insisted on treating every human being as deserving of dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances.